They always tell you that if you want to find God or peace, you need to go where the pavement ends, where the noise of the city dies out and is replaced by the sound of wind moving through ancient timber. My family understood that better than anyone, which is why for the last 140 years, ever since my great-grandfather Silas put the first stake in the ground back in 1885, the Sterling family has held on to these 100 acres of Virginia bottomland like it was holy ground. I grew up here, breathing in dust and diesel, watching the world change from the porch of a farmhouse that has outlasted wars, depressions, and hurricanes, believing that as long as I stayed on my side of the fence, the madness of the modern world would stay on its side. I was wrong. The war didn't start with soldiers or sirens. It started on a Tuesday morning with the kind of heavy, humid silence that hangs over the valley before a storm. When I opened my mailbox to find a thick, cream-colored envelope embossed with a golden willow tree logo I didn't recognize. Inside was a letter from something called the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, an entity I had never joined, demanding I pay a $100,000 fine within 14 days for the unauthorized construction of a non-conforming industrial structure, my barn. I remember standing there by the gravel road, reading those words again and again, laughing a dry, confused laugh because surely this was a prank. Surely no one is insane enough to fine a man for building a barn on a farm that has been recorded in the county deed books since before the invention of the automobile. You have to understand, this barn wasn't just a shed. It was my life's work, a steel-reinforced sanctuary I had built with my own hands and my father's savings to fix tractors and store the harvest, a structure I had obsessed over, pouring concrete thick enough to stop a tank, dreaming of the day I could look at it and say I made that. I thought a polite phone call would fix it, so I dialed the number on the letterhead, left a calm voicemail explaining that Art Sterling doesn't live in Willow Creek, that my land is independent, and that they needed to check their maps because they were clearly lost. I hung up thinking that was the end of it, just a clerical error in some office where the air conditioning is too cold and the coffee is too weak, but I didn't know then what I know now. I didn't know that this wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated opening move in a chess game I didn't even know I was playing. 2 hours later, I was greasing the axle of my combine when I heard the crunch of gravel, not the slow, respectful roll of a neighbor's truck, but the aggressive, fast approach of someone who thinks they own the road, and I looked up to see a pristine white Mercedes SUV sliding to a halt in my driveway. The door opened, and out stepped a woman who looked like she had been manufactured in a factory that specializes in condescension, wearing a blazer that cost more than my truck and high heels that immediately sank into the soft earth of my property. This was Patricia Vance, the president of the Willow Creek HOA, and she didn't come alone. She brought 2 men in matching polo shirts carrying clipboards and measuring lasers, walking onto my land with the casual arrogance of conquerors. I wiped the grease from my hands, stepped out to meet them, and asked Patricia if she was the one who sent the love letter, to which she simply smiled, a tight, practiced expression that didn't reach her eyes, and told me that my barn violated the aesthetic integrity of the development's viewshed. I tried to be reasonable. I really did. I told her, Ms. Vance, you are standing on Sterling land that has nothing to do with your subdivision, land that was here when your houses were just a glint in a developer's eye. But she just waved a hand dismissively and said that according to the Vanguard Development Expansion Plan of 2018, my southern perimeter fell under their architectural oversight jurisdiction. It was the most absurd thing I had ever heard, like a stranger walking into your living room and telling you they don't like your couch. But when I told them to leave, to get off my property before I called the sheriff, the air changed, the polite veneer dropped, and Patricia looked at me with cold, dead certainty and said, "You have 14 days to pay or demolish the structure, Mr. Sterling. Otherwise, we will place a lien on this property and seize it for noncompliance." They drove off, leaving me standing in the dust, my heart hammering not with fear, but with a slow, burning rage, the kind that starts in your gut and works its way out, because I realized then that they weren't just annoying neighbors, they were predators. I went inside and called Elias Thorne, the only lawyer in the county I trusted, a man who wore suspenders and smoked cheap cigars, but knew land law better than he knew his own children. And when I read him the letter, he didn't laugh. He got very quiet and said, "Art, get Mitch out there to survey the lines immediately. because HOAs don't get this aggressive unless they are trying to hide something massive. The next morning, another letter arrived, delivered by a terrified-looking intern who practically threw it at me and ran, raising the fine to $115,000 and adding a daily penalty for hostility, which made me realize that Patricia and the Vanguard group weren't just trying to find me. They were trying to break me, trying to bury me in so much paper and debt that I would just roll over and sell them the land they clearly coveted. I sat on my porch as the sun went down, staring at the barn that was supposed to be my legacy, and I made a promise to the ghosts of my ancestors that I would burn every cent I had before I let these people take 1 inch of dirt that didn't belong to them. Mitch, my surveyor, arrived 2 days later with enough equipment to map the moon, his face grim as he set up his tripods and drones, and we spent the morning walking the southern line, finding the old iron stakes my grandfather had driven into the ground with a sledgehammer, confirming that my barn was a solid 400 feet inside my property line. We were feeling good, feeling vindicated, until the white Mercedes showed up again, Patricia storming out like a general whose front lines had been breached, screaming that we were conducting an illegal, unauthorized survey and threatening to sue Mitch personally. Mitch, bless his heart, just looked at her over the rim of his sunglasses and said, "Ma'am, if you take one more step, I'm going to have you arrested for trespassing on an active survey site," which shut her up long enough for us to finish. But as she drove away, promising legal annihilation, Mitch turned to me and said, "Art, something is wrong here. The GPS coordinates on their development map don't match the county records. They are drifting north." I didn't know what he meant until the next day, when Mitch drove back to my farm, walked into my workshop without knocking, and unrolled a massive, color-coded map on my workbench, his hands shaking slightly as he smoothed out the corners. He pointed to the red line that marked my historic boundary, and then he pointed to a cluster of beige boxes, houses, that Vanguard and the HOA had built. "Art," he whispered, looking at me with wide, disbelief-filled eyes. "They didn't just encroach on your land, they built on it." I stared at the map, my brain refusing to process the visual information, counting the boxes that crossed over onto the Sterling property line. "How many?" I asked, my voice sounding hollow in the tin shed. "9, Mitch said. "They built 9 luxury homes, 3 driveways, and the entire Willow Creek Community Clubhouse and sales office on your land." The silence in the workshop was deafening, the kind of silence that follows a gunshot, as I stared at the map and realized that the people fining me $100,000 for a barn were currently sitting in an illegal office built on soil my family had paid taxes on for a century. It wasn't just a mistake. It was impossible for it to be a mistake. You don't accidentally build 9 mansions and a clubhouse across a property line unless you are either criminally incompetent or criminally malicious. I spent the next 3 nights awake, fueled by black coffee and a cold, focused fury, digging through county records online, pulling up every permit Vanguard development had ever filed, and what I found made my blood run cold. They had filed amended plats, forging signatures that looked vaguely like mine, but were clearly faked, submitting zoning adjustments at 4:59 p.m. on Fridays hoping no one would notice, essentially stealing 6 acres of prime land because it was cheaper to steal it than to buy it from me. Then came the threat. I walked out to my mailbox under the cover of a bruised purple twilight and found a single sheet of yellow legal paper. No envelope, just a note scrawled in thick black marker. "Stop digging or lose everything." I stood there in the growing dark, listening to the crickets and the distant hum of traffic, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of genuine physical danger, realizing that millions of dollars were at stake for Vanguard, and people have been killed for far less than the price of 9 luxury homes. I went back inside, took my father's old Remington shotgun out of the cabinet, cleaned it, loaded it, and set it by the front door, not because I wanted to use it, but because I suddenly lived in a world where paper threats might turn into real ones. Elias, my lawyer, told me to play it cool, to gather the evidence and wait for the trap to spring. And sure enough, 2 days later, Patricia showed up on my porch again. But this time she wasn't the imperious queen. She was the sweet neighbor, holding a Tupperware container of still warm peach cobbler. She stood there with a desperate, plastic smile, telling me that things had gotten off on the wrong foot, that we are all just neighbors here, and invited me to a community reconciliation mixer at the clubhouse on Friday night. I knew it was a setup. Elias knew it was a setup. He said, "Art, they want you in that room to sign something, or to admit to something, or just to get you on camera looking unreasonable." But I took the cobbler, looked her dead in the eye, and said, "I'll be there." Friday night arrived, and I drove my battered Ford truck down the road to the Willow Creek Clubhouse, a building that I now knew sat squarely on my property, and parked right in front, blocking their future resident parking sign. The inside was like a spread in a lifestyle magazine, all white linen and fake candles, filled with nervous board members and a few confused homeowners. And Patricia rushed over to me with a glass of cheap wine, trying to steer me toward a table where a sign-in sheet waited. I picked up the clipboard and saw the fine print immediately. By signing, the attendee agrees to abide by all current and future community covenants and acknowledges the existing boundary demarcations. A legal trick so dirty it made me want to spit. Patricia hovered, her breath smelling of mints and anxiety, saying, "Just a formality, Art, just for the insurance," her eyes darting to the pen in my hand. I smiled, the kind of smile a wolf gives a lamb, and said, "Actually, Patricia, I have a formality of my own," and I pulled a document out of my jacket pocket, a certified cease and desist order and a notice of intent to sue for catastrophic boundary encroachment, and handed it to her. "I need you to sign this, just to acknowledge receipt," I said, my voice carrying across the quiet room, causing the jazz music to seem suddenly very loud. She looked at the paper, her face draining of color, her hands trembling so hard the wine in her glass created little tidal waves, and for a moment she tried to laugh it off, but I didn't move. I just held out the pen. She signed it, thinking it was just a bluff, thinking her lawyers would crush me, not realizing she had just signed a document proving she was personally aware of the dispute before the court date, destroying her plausible deniability defense. I walked out of there without drinking the wine, feeling the eyes of every person in that room burning into my back, knowing that I had just pulled the pin on a grenade and tossed it onto their coffee table. The court hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and I barely slept, pacing the floors of my farmhouse, wondering if money would beat truth, if Vanguard's high-priced legal team would find a loophole, a way to paint me as the villain. But when the day came, the courtroom was packed, Patricia sitting there in a severe gray suit looking like a cornered animal, flanked by 3 lawyers who looked bored and expensive. The judge, a man named Judge Calloway who had a reputation for eating developers for breakfast, listened as Elias laid it all out. The 1885 deed, the tax records, Mitch's GPS data, the forged documents, and finally, the map showing the 9 houses and the clubhouse squatting on Sterling land. Vanguard's lawyer stood up, slick and confident, arguing that it was an innocent topographical error and that demolishing these homes would cause undue hardship to the community, suggesting I should just accept a settlement check and sell them the land. Judge Calloway leaned forward, peering over his glasses, and asked the lawyer, "Did your client fine Mr. Sterling $100,000 for a barn on his own property while sitting in an office illegally built on that very same property?" The lawyer stammered, "Well, Your Honor, that was a separate administrative matter regarding." "It is not separate," the judge roared, slamming his hand down, making Patricia jump in her seat. "It is the definition of bad faith. You have stolen land, built on it, and then had the audacity to fine the victim for existing." He turned to me, his expression softening just a fraction, and asked, "Mr. Sterling, as the legal owner of the land in question, what is your desired remedy? Do you want monetary compensation?" I stood up, my hands gripping the railing, looking at Patricia, looking at the developers who thought they could buy the world, and I said, "Your Honor, I don't want their money. I want my land back. All of it." The judge nodded, picked up his gavel, and delivered the sentence that would ring in my ears for the rest of my life. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff. The defendants have 30 days to remove all encroaching structures and restore the land to its original agricultural state. If you do not, the county will do it for you and send you the bill. You might think that watching a demolition is a violent thing, loud and chaotic, but when the day finally came, it felt strangely like a surgical procedure, a necessary amputation to save the patient. The sun rose blood-red over Oak Haven fields, illuminating the line of heavy yellow machinery parked on the road. bulldozers, excavators, and dump trucks, waiting like mechanical beasts of prey. The sheriff, a good man named Sheriff Miller who had known my father, stood by the gate with his arms crossed, watching as a crowd gathered. Neighbors, reporters, and former residents of Willow Creek who had been sold lies along with their granite countertops. Patricia was there too, screaming at the deputies, waving papers, crying about community assets and destruction of property. Her composure completely shattered, her voice cracking as she realized her reign of terror was ending in a pile of rubble. I gave the nod to the foreman, a burly guy with a beard who looked like he enjoyed his job a little too much, and the first excavator roared to life, its diesel engine coughing black smoke into the pristine morning air. It rolled forward, tracks clanking, and raised its massive hydraulic arm over the roof of the clubhouse, the symbol of their arrogance, the place where they had plotted to steal my heritage. When the bucket came down, it sounded like a thunderclap, glass shattering, wood splintering, the fake stucco facade crumbling into dust as the machine tore through the building like it was made of wet cardboard. I watched Patricia collapse into the arms of her lawyer, sobbing, not because she was sad, but because she was losing, because for the first time in her life, she couldn't speak to the manager, she couldn't write a fine, she had to watch reality crash down on her head. It took 3 days to bring it all down. 9 houses, empty and hollow, were crushed into debris, the driveways ripped up in jagged chunks, the manicured lawns churned back into mud. I stood there for every minute of it, drinking coffee, feeling a profound, heavy sadness mixed with the relief, because even though I won, it's a tragedy that so much labor and material had to be wasted just to prove a point about right and wrong. As the last truck hauled away the final load of debris, Sheriff Miller walked over to where Patricia was still arguing with a deputy, and I saw him pull out a pair of handcuffs. It turned out the district attorney had been watching too, and the forgery of the zoning documents wasn't just a civil issue. It was a felony. She was arrested right there in the dirt she tried to steal, led away in the back of a cruiser while the neighbors she had terrorized watched in stunned silence. In the weeks that followed, the noise faded, the news vans left, and the silence returned to Oak Haven. But the land was scarred, raw and ugly, stripped of its topsoil and covered in the tracks of the machines. I didn't leave it that way. I rented a tractor and spent the next month tilling the earth, turning the soil, sweating under the sun until the ground was soft and ready again. I planted an orchard there. 200 apple trees, Honeycrisp and Granny Smith, planted in straight, honest rows right where the houses used to stand. It was my way of healing the wound, of putting roots back into the ground that would outlive me, just like the barn, just like the farm. One evening, about a year later, I was out pruning the saplings when a kid on a bicycle stopped on the road, a young boy from the surviving part of the subdivision. He looked at the trees, then at me, and asked, "Is it true there used to be houses here?" I leaned on my shovel, wiped my brow, and looked at the green leaves fluttering in the wind. "Yeah," I said, "there were, but they didn't belong here." "My dad says you're the guy who beat the bank," the kid said, eyes wide. "I didn't beat anyone, son," I told him, looking out over the valley as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the grass. I just reminded them where the line was. As he rode away, I walked back to the barn, the structure that started it all, still standing strong and proud, and I realized that justice doesn't always feel like a victory parade. Sometimes it just feels like quiet. It feels like waking up and knowing that the land under your feet is yours, and that no amount of money, lawyers, or cream-colored envelopes can change that. But it makes you wonder, doesn't it? In a world where corporations can rewrite maps and HOAs can act like governments, how many people didn't fight back? How many people lost their family legacy because they were too scared to ask for a survey? I got my land back, but looking at the scars in the earth, I have to ask, at what price did this peace come? And is it really justice if you have to burn the world down just to be left alone?